Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. GeForce GTX 1050 versus 1050 Ti. Which should you buy in 2018? 7 brand new games benchmarked. I've never tested them before, including not only performance comparisons, but percentage charts and dollar cost per frame per second charts to show you the relative value of these cards at the current prices they're currently going for. Right now on Amazon and Newegg, you can find a GTX 1050 for about $150 and a 1050 Ti for about $200. That's not what they used to cost, but that's what they cost today in 2018. It is worth noting that the 1050 Ti does have more CUDA cores and it does have 4 gigs of VRAM versus the 2 gigs in the 1050. Now, many people ask the question, is it worth the extra money? There's currently a $50 price difference between them. That's what we're looking at today. It is also worth noting that the prices on the 1060s have come down recently. A couple of months ago, the 1060s were way too expensive to consider, but they're now down below the $300 mark, and they might be worth considering. If you have $250 to $300 to spend, a GTX 1060 3GB card might be a better value than the 1050 Ti, although it is nearly double the price of a 1050, so that kind of puts it into a different price category. We will look at that with a fresh look with these games in a future video, but for now, it's these two cards. Now, the test bench I'm testing these on is the first generation Ryzen 7 1800X. Don't be alarmed by the sound of that because it doesn't really matter. A Ryzen 5 1500X or 1600X would frankly give the same performance results you're about to see. The CPU usage was way low. It's just my standard test bench. But if you've got either a 1500X or 1600X or a Ryzen 5 1400 or 1600 overclocked to 3.7 gigahertz, which is what my 1800X is running at, then you'd get exactly these same results with one of these cards. A Ryzen 3 1200 or 1300X with 4 cores, 4 threads might not be quite as good, but so long as you have at least the 1400 or better, you should see these same results on your own system. Now, before we continue with the rest of this video, I recently became a Humble Bundle partner. There is a link down in the video description below to Humble Bundle. If you don't know what it is, I will be doing a full review on it at some point. I personally have been a Humble Bundle customer since before I had a YouTube channel. It's a great way to support charity, and now it's a great way to support charity and tech deals and developers if you are so inclined. There's a variety of software deals available there. They have ebooks, comics, downloadable software, games, and various other bundles, and something called Humble Bundle Monthly, where you can spend $12 per month, at least that's the current price, and you get a collection of games every month and a discount in the store. So if you use the link down in the description below, you can support charity, you can support tech deals, and get great deals on games, software, ebooks, and comics. And with that being said, back to the video. Here in this video, there's going to be a bunch of charts incoming. Keep in mind that I've got 3 charts per game, and in fact, multiple resolutions and multiple detail settings. So if you look at the length of the video and go, oh my gosh, there's a lot of detail packed into this video, please give it a chance and let me voice over through the charts and explain it. Because if you've been trying to figure out where to spend your money, if you're on a budget and you need to save your money because you don't have a lot of money to spend, this will give you an idea about which one of these is the right choice for you. Now, before we get to the benchmarks, I would like to remind you that links to these video cards and the CPUs are down in the video description below. Those are links to Amazon and Newegg. They are affiliate links. They do support the channel. I bought these cards and the Ryzen CPUs myself, at least the 2nd generation version. If you want to support me and you want to see more of this type of content, please consider using those when shopping if you found this video helpful and useful. Now on to the benchmarks. The first game we're going to look at is Assassin's Creed Origins Low Detail Preset, and I've got a bunch of results for you. 720p, 900p, and 1080p. This is actually the first time I've done benchmark results in 900p, so it's sort of the middle resolution between the 720 and 1080. Part of my goal here was to provide a gradient of performance so that you could get an idea of where the fall off was. At 720p on the left average, the GTX 1050 did 75 frames per second and the 1050 Ti did 82 frames per second. This is a difference, but not a massive difference. It's pretty respectable, all things considered. Coming up to 900p, the difference grows a bit. We have 59 to 71, but still very playable on both cards. And then at 1080p, we have 51 and 61 frames per second. The minimums, however, at 900p and 1080p are quite a bit lower. The GTX 1050 Ti does have a bit more oomph, and it is going to have better minimum performance numbers, but at 720p, frankly, both cards were neck and neck. Now that's great, you say, but how is the percentage difference? How much real increase is there between these two cards? At 720p, it's not much, 5 to 9%, but it's at 900p and 1080p that you start to see a real difference. In fact, there's up to a 29% performance difference, at least at 900p low. Interestingly enough, it was less of a difference at 1080p. Now, you can run these benchmarks 3 and 4 times and you get slightly different variations. I always run these built-in benchmarks at least 3 times on each card, but yeah, the percentage difference was actually lower at 1080p than it was at 900p. Another way to look at the performance of these cards is the dollar cost per frame per second. Lower is better. Take the performance, divide it by the card's cost, and you come up with a dollar amount. Now, I used $150 for the 1050 and $200 for the 1050 Ti. That's not really the retail price, but that's kind of the street price they're currently going for in April of 2018 when I recorded this. And basically what it means is even though the GTX 1050 is slower, it costs less for the performance it gives you. At 720p, it's $2 versus $2.44. At 1080p, it's $2.94 to $3.28. Now these are relatively close, and in all honesty, if I wanted to play Assassin's Creed Origins and it was between these two cards, yes, I would buy a 1050 Ti. I think it's worth the extra $50. But you are in fact paying a small premium to get that performance. Part of that's the extra VRAM, and part of it's a faster, higher end card. Next up, we have Dawn of War 3, low detail, again the same 3 resolutions, 720p, 900p, and 1080p. Now, not all the benchmarks and charts I'm going to show you in this video will look like this, but the truth of the matter is the VRAM doesnnt make a difference, it's just the CUDA core count difference. The GTX 1050 Ti, which has more processing power, is faster, which makes perfect sense, but it costs more. So the question is it a good value for the money? Here you can see the percentage difference. These percentage differences right here exactly line up, or pretty close anyway, with the CUDA core count difference between the two cards, so the VRAM is not making any difference whatsoever. It's simply there's more processing power on a GTX 1050 Ti. And since that's the case, it simply comes down to what you pay for the cards. At the $150 and $200 price points they're currently at, the 1050 is a phenomenal deal, relatively speaking. $1.46 per frame per second at 720p versus $1.80. At 1080p, you're paying $2.31 per frame per second on the 1050 versus $2.78 per frame per second on the 1050 Ti. Really, the only time the 1050 Ti really makes economic sense, at least at these prices, is when you actually need the 4 gigs of VRAM, which is actually not all that often, but occasionally it is nice. Now, Far Cry 5 is exactly the same boat. With low detail at these 3 resolutions, you're simply not using more than 2 gigs of VRAM. Now, wait a minute, you say, why don't we increase the detail to high? After all, that will then enable us to use the 4 gigs of VRAM. Sure, do you think a GTX 1050 Ti has enough compute performance to play Far Cry 5 at high detail with more than 2 gigs of textures loaded? Yeah, it really doesn't. In fact, if you look at 1080p, we're at 57 frames per second at low detail. Put that at high detail, and you could easily end up under 30 frames per second. Yes, you'll need more than 2 gigs of VRAM. 2 gigabytes on the 1050 won't be enough. But it's irrelevant, because the 1050 Ti doesn't have the compute power to use it anyway. Now, when it comes to performance difference, the gap here is larger than it is on some of the earlier games. We're looking at a 15 to up to 19% performance difference between the two cards. The question is that performance difference worth a $50 price difference? Now, let me preface this by saying worth it is a very individual, personal decision. Is it worth paying $3.51 per frame per second at 1080p average performance versus $3.06? Well, that's for you to decide. If you want closer to 60 frames per second at 1080p low, maybe it is. Pay the $200, get a card that does it, and you're good to go. But if you want the deal, if you want the value for the money, it's generally going to be the GTX 1050, not the 1050 Ti, except in a few circumstances. Final Fantasy 15 has an interesting built-in benchmark that does not provide frames per second numbers, but rather provides a score. So you have to download the Final Fantasy benchmark on your own computer if you want to compare the performance to another one, but it's not actually giving you a frame rate per se. Yes, I could run fraps, yes, I could measure the frame rate, but instead I'm just reporting the score. We have 5,223 points on the 1050 versus 6,324 points on the 1050 Ti. All too often when you look at these scores you go, oh, well, I better buy a 1050 Ti, it's the better deal, right? Well, it's worth noting that both of these are considered good performance according to the built-in benchmark. They're labeled as good, or at least good enough. This is at 720p at standard detail. 1080p, the performance is much, much worse, and I really wouldn't play this game at 1080p on either of these cards. Now that score does work out to a 21% performance difference, which is not too shabby. That's enough of a difference that it would be at least noticeable if you compared them side by side. Now if you only have one card, you're not going to know the difference, but if you put these together side by side, 21% is enough to notice. The other test that doesn't include FPS numbers is World of Tanks Encore. Now, this also shows a difference, but not a huge one. We're at 25,000 and change versus 28,000 and change. The truth of the matter is World of Tanks, even the new 1.0 update, even the new graphical updates, will play just fine on either of these cards. Now, this was tested at 1080p medium. If you turn it to ultra detail, yeah, okay, not so much. You do run into some issues there. So, no, I don't recommend ultra detail on either of these cards, but frankly, medium is still very, very beautiful, and neither of these cards is going to have any issues running games like World of Tanks. I'm including the percentage number here, again, to compare to, for example, Final Fantasy 15, which had a much larger performance difference. This, at 12%, is not nearly as noticeable. This is almost a rounding error. It's larger than a rounding error, to be sure, but side by side, playing on different maps, matches, combat, explosions, could you tell the difference between these two cards in a blind test? I'm willing to bet the answer is no as often as it is yes. So the 1050 is probably the better deal for World of Tanks. Now back to the FPS charts, we have Forza Motorsport 7. I've got two different sets of charts. These are 720p, and I did something different here. I did 720p low and 720p high. This way you can see the difference between detail settings at the same resolution. 123 frames per second average on the GTX 1050 versus 145 on the 1050 Ti, but this is at 720p low. Increase it to high detail and the gap increases, 50 to 82. So if you want to play at high detail, the VRAM use and the compute power makes a difference, then you'd want a GTX 1050 Ti. You can see some of that difference in the VRAM right there. But at low detail, there's a smaller difference because it's not using more than 2 gigs of VRAM. Now the minimums are almost identical at 720p low, which is quite interesting, but the minimums at high are dramatically different. Again, VRAM issues, high detail, larger textures, more is being loaded into the card. So as you crank up details, you need more VRAM. Now the percentage difference chart tells the tale. At 720p low, it's a minor difference. Yes, okay, it's almost 18% at the average, and it's 5.5% at low with the minimums, but still that's not a dramatic difference. That's accounted for in the compute power of the cards. 64% average performance difference at 720p high is not the compute power, that is the VRAM. The 1050 completely ran out of VRAM, and that's why the performance is so bad. Same thing with the minimum details. It just isn't there. So if you've got a game that wants more VRAM, you can often see huge dramatic performance differences as you see right here. Please note that you could set the game to 720p high, but turn textures down a bit. If you turn the textures down a bit and you get the VRAM usage down under 2 gigs, then this performance gap will go away. Looking at the dollar cost per frame per second for the first time in this video, I'm going to show you a situation where the 1050 Ti is cheaper per frame. $2.44 per frame per second on the Ti versus $3 on the 1050, and that's because the performance difference is so dramatic. 64%, that's why. But notice that at low detail, the 1050 remains cheaper. The 1050 really is the deal unless the price gap narrows. Now, it is worth noting that there have been times in the life of these cards where the price gap has only been $20. And when the price gap is $20, you buy the 1050 Ti all day long. The compute performance is worth $20. But in April of 2018, when I'm filming this, it's $50. Now, did I promise you extensive testing, or did I promise you extensive testing? 1080p low, 1080p high. Basically, these cards absolutely demonstrate why the extra VRAM is needed once you kick up the resolution and or details. 93 to 132 and 44 to 70. Yes, a GTX 1050 Ti will average over 60 frames per second at 1080p high detail, but the 1050 most certainly will not. But the 1050 would be playable because if you leave everything on dynamic resolution, it'll adjust the details, it'll still look really pretty, and it'll still give you 60 frames per second. The interesting thing about this game is that I actually have to go in and manually set every detail setting because the dynamic settings basically adjust the details to hold a steady frame rate rather than a steady detail setting. Same thing here, 42 and 43% performance difference even at low detail because of the VRAM, and then at 1080p high detail, there's a 59% performance difference in the average. If you want to crank up details and resolution and don't want to compromise on texture detail, well, you need more VRAM. Just like the high detail at 720p, the GTX 1050 Ti is actually the better value even at a $50 price difference if you're going beyond 2 gigabytes of VRAM usage. Now, it's not that common. I've shown you several benchmarks where it makes very little difference or not enough of a difference to justify, but now I'm showing you benchmarks where it does. It is worth noting, if you want to show a certain result, it's not hard to go out and find benchmarks that give you the result. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to show you both sides of the equation, both sides of the story, situations where the 1050 is a better deal, situations where the 1050 Ti is a better deal, why that's the case, and then ultimately let you make up your own mind because, hey, your money, your computer, do what you want. Now, this next set of benchmark charts does require a bit more explanation, or at least perhaps a demo. And so I'm actually going to show you the built-in benchmark this time, and I'm going to show you the results and also put it into chart form. This is Ghost Recon Wildlands medium detail preset. No changes have been made other than setting it to medium detail. This is important because I'm then going to show you medium detail preset with textures turned to low. In other words, custom. I very rarely, in fact, I may never have actually done a custom detail setting on one of these Ghost Recons or any of the AAA games that I do, but I'm doing it here. Partly I want to see what y'all's reaction is in the comments down below, partly because I wanted to see for myself how much of a difference does it make if you lower the texture detail but leave everything else the same. Now, lowering the texture detail is certainly going to lower the load on the GPU, but it's also going to make sure that we have no VRAM issues. 40 frames per second average. We're coming down here. There's texture quality. We're going to lower texture quality down to low, hit F to accept. Now we're going to run the benchmark. Everything is the same, 900p resolution. We're not doing 720, we're not doing 1080. I tried those, I decided to settle on 900. It's a good compromise resolution. The only difference here is the VRAM usage is lower. Now, if you watch the real-time VRAM usage in the upper left-hand corner, you'll notice that we were at about 1.7, 1.8 gigabytes of our 2 gigs of VRAM on the first run, and now we're at 1.5 to 1.6. So theoretically, they should both be below the 2 gigabytes necessary, right? Well, let's take a look at the results. The results were 40 frames per second when everything was set to medium. But now that we've set it to medium detail preset low textures, do you think it's going to be similar? A little less? Maybe a lot less? I don't know. Show of hands, what do you think the result's going to be? And 40 frames per second at medium texture, 52 frames per second with the texture set to low. That's not a small difference. That's a huge difference. Now, I also tested on the 1050 Ti, and the big takeaway here is I want you to compare 900p medium detail versus 900p medium detail with low textures. 40 to 60 frames per second on the left-hand side. That is not a small difference right there. That is a huge difference. Compare that to 52 to 63 when the textures were turned down to low. Now, yes, that's still a difference, but that difference is more accounted for in the compute performance difference between the cards more than the VRAM. What this chart should be telling you is that even though it didn't say we were using 2 gigs of VRAM, we were clearly VRAM limited at medium detail at 900p. That's the only explanation for 40 to 60 frames per second difference. Look at the minimums, 33 to 49, again, a huge difference. Turn it down to low texture and it's 45 to 52. So clearly we are VRAM limited without turning the textures down to low. Putting those differences in percentage form, you can see here we have a 50% performance difference at medium detail between the two cards. Again, this is not a small difference, that is huge. But it's much smaller once you turn it down to low because compute performance difference. So if you're finding your performance is bad and you have a GTX 1050, the first thing you may want to look at is turning down your texture detail to get your VRAM use down. When you run out of VRAM, the 1050 Ti is actually the better deal. $33.33 per frame per second at medium texture detail versus $375. But if you turn it down to low, at least just on the textures, leaving everything else at medium, you have $2.88 on the 1050 versus $3.17. Now, would I buy either of these cards to play Ghost Recon Wildlands? No, I would buy a GTX 1060. Frankly, a 1060 3 gig will play 1080p, high detail, 60 frames per second without a problem. But if you can't afford that wherever you're at, you have to go with the 1050. Here's the numbers. Now that was a ton of information, and if you're still here, thank you, I appreciate you watching. I would like to say that the main virtue of the GTX 1050 Ti is the fact that it is the most powerful graphics card you can currently buy that does not require a 6-pin PCI Express power connector. I didn't mention it before with the 1060. Its one major deficiency versus this is the 1060s require a PCI Express connector, and if you have an older machine or a pre-built Acer, Asus, HP, Lenovo, etc. that does not have that connector in your machine, you may find a 1060 is hard to install. This will drop in and install in virtually anything. I've installed it in a wide variety of pre-built machines, drops in, works beautifully. That's its main grace. The 1050 is a better value for most people with a $50 price delta. As I mentioned during the benchmarks, if the price gap narrows, if you find these for only $20 or $25 apart, please, by all means, get the 1050 Ti. For $20 difference, yes, it's absolutely worth it just for the performance difference alone. But right now in April of 2018, when I'm filming this video, there's a $50 difference. And for most people, in most situations, except for the one I showed you in the video, really I would skip the Ti and just get a 1050. Or if you can handle the PCI Express power connector and you have a little bit of extra money, take a look at the GTX 1060 3 gig cards because they are more than 50% faster in compute than the 1050 Ti. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section. And as always, check the links in the video description. They do support the channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.